Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll look at the readings for the fifth Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 13, also known as Proper 8, which this year falls on June 27th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive for today is on the theology of abundance versus the theology of scarcity. We noticed as we read through these readings that contrast shows up a few times.
Mm-hmm.
We realized that these may not be phrases that most of our listeners are familiar with. So, this is a contrast of two different approaches to ministry, as it's often discussed, but also you can think of it as a contrast between two different approaches to life. Mm-hmm. Do you start out assuming that God has provided enough or plenty of resources for everyone? Or do you start out assuming that there won't be enough for everyone? Where is your point of view toward the universe directed from? That is the difference between the theology of abundance or the theology of scarcity. If you are looking at the world from a theology of abundance kind of standpoint, you start out by assuming that we have enough. It's going to be enough. We have the resources that we need. The question is just getting them to the right people in the right places and all that. Versus, if you have a theology of scarcity mentality, then you're going to constantly be convinced that there isn't enough, there will never be enough, and you have to, throw together weird fixes or do emergency things or stuff like that in order to make things work out for you, and probably the rest of the world is not going to be okay. Now, when we actually look at the world and how many people we have and the resources that we have, I forgot to look up the citation for this, but I have read in a number of places that we do have enough resources on this planet for everyone. By a fairly decent margin. We can't all be billionaires, but it would be okay.
We have enough to feed the world.
We have some transportation issues, but we could fix those. We made it to the moon, we would be fine. Except, of course, that instead of making sure that everyone has enough resources, we have decided to embrace capitalism. So, therefore, we have...
Just to be clear, the we is like the governments and institutions that hold the power and wealth in this world.
Yes, and therefore poverty and billionaires exist, whereas in a world where we were coming at the world from a theology of abundance standpoint, probably neither of those would exist, almost certainly. I really can't see that happening.
Yeah.
But capitalism is, at heart, a scarcity mindset, except, of course, that capitalism does not have a heart, and neither do corporations, because they're not people. Just throwing that one out there for free.
Exactly.
A scarcity mindset can lead to a lot of mistreatment, and I'm not just talking about governments now, I'm also talking about your local church council. But mistreatment, greed, miserliness, and some people going without when they don't actually have to. Also, there tends to be a lot of fear and unnecessary divisiveness when people start grouping up into, groups to fight each other, because that tends to happen when you don't think there's enough to go around.
I just finished the fourth book in the Graceling Realm books by Kristen Kishore, and this actually gets at the heart of what's going on in Winterkeep, the fourth book, where the conflict that drives the book is really rooted in people who are experiencing and living out a theology of scarcity. They don't think they're enough. They've been exploiting the environment, and as we know from our conversation with Reverend Abby last week, the exploitation of the environment is very much part of capitalism. It's also very much part of a theology of scarcity that says that the Earth's there are not enough, and therefore they are just for humans, and we don't need to prioritize caring for the Earth. And so that's kind of what's going on in Winterkeep, while Bitterblue, who is the Queen of Mancia, who we find in the third book, called Bitterblue, is when she starts to come into her own as queen, is thinking about things from a theology of abundance, right? To say everyone in her country, in her kingdom, needs and deserves education to be able to read and write, to be able to have their needs met. And there's some stuff that I'm going to try not to spoil, but also for her, that includes the environment. That we shouldn't be exploiting the environment. We should be caring for the environment and protecting the environment as much as possible.
Yeah, I would definitely say that that fits in with a theology of abundance, because part of having a theology of abundance is not wanting to destroy the resources you have. That seems foolish. So a scarcity mindset can lead to all of those things. A abundance-based mindset, on the other hand, can lead to generosity and openness. And as I have discussed many times on this show, I grew up watching Star Trek, which the first couple series tried to emphasize that humanity had come into sort of a theology, an abundance mindset. I wouldn't say a theology of abundance, because they had also kind of mostly abandoned religion. But in later series, from Deep Space Nine and also in some ways Voyager, we discover that actually Earth has the abundance mindset and can pull that off, because they do genuinely have enough. Whereas there are plenty of places in the universe that really don't, or that really do have a scarcity mindset and are, exploiting people and doing horrible things. And also places where there simply just isn't enough, and they need help from other places. So early on, it seems like Star Trek is all about the abundance mindset, and then later on there's sort of an ongoing contrast, which gets pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think that brings up the idea of, like, when we're talking about a theology of abundance, we're not talking about a theology of excessiveness. Right? A theology of abundance says there is enough for everyone. It does not say there is enough for everyone to have 5 jets. And you kind of talked about this.
Yeah, there's that episode of Firefly where they visit Bridget's ex-husband, and he lives on a planet where there's a bunch of floating islands, and they're all billionaires, and they all have their own floating island. And also, it turns out that we realize that the people who work for them are, often not treated that great, so maybe there's not actually so much abundance there anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where I always want to be careful when I'm talking about a theology of abundance, because I think it's really important and really faithful biblically, especially, to live into a theology of abundance. But I think some people, if they're not understanding the fullness of what a theology of abundance is, are going to assume, oh, that means we get whatever we want, whenever we want. And I think especially a lot of Native people have had a really great critique of that piece, right? We could create reusable energy resources. We could create more windmills, more solar panels, more hydroelectric plants, but each of those also impacts the environment.
Sure.
And what we're not taking into account, I think, globally and culturally yet, is how much those still do cause harm to the environment, right? We still have to mine the materials for solar panels. We still have to build. We interrupt waterways. We interrupt fish's migratory patterns when we build hydroelectric plants.
And the number of not very bright birds that kill themselves in wind turbines continues to rise.
Right. And so there is that space where also there is enough, and we don't need as much as we think we need.
Yes.
Right? We have excessiveness right now. So there's not enough for everyone in this country to live the way upper middle class people in this country live.
Right. And by we have excessiveness, I think we're talking about America.
Mostly, yes.
Yeah. I would also say that in order to have a solid theology of abundance, you also really need to have what I've heard called a theology of enough.
Mm-hmm.
An understanding of, yes, this is enough. This is the line. I don't need more than this. I might want more than this. I have my own mental arguments with myself about chocolate on that score on a fairly regular basis.
I was thinking about ice cream, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, sure. You do have to know where enough is. So, no, we can't all have 5 jets. No, we can't all have our own floating islands. At least not yet. We have to invent anti-gravity something in order to get there. But we can all have enough to eat. We can all have basic medical care. We can all have shelter that is reasonably safe and reasonably hygienic,
Yeah.
So.
And that's, I think, it is really hard. And I think this is also a space that, particularly as a pastor and someone who's lived as an adult without a job and in between jobs and in between housing, it is hard. it is a challenge to live into a theology of abundance, particularly given the way capitalism shoves a theology of scarcity down our throats.
Yeah.
It requires intentional spiritual discipline. It requires the choice to trust in God's abundance. And just for some biblical context, a lot of where we as Christians get the language for theology of abundance comes from the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, God talks about abundant life, not for one person, but for all people, right? So when we're talking about the theology of abundance, we are always talking about it in community. Right. We are always talking about it in the context of all people, not in an individual context, which I think helps mitigate the excessive versus abundant.
Yeah. Although you can also be an introvert with a abundance mindset too. You don't have to go out and constantly be among people, but
for sure.
Hide in your bedroom and
There is nothing about God's theology of abundance that requires you have lots of interactions with people. It's a recognition of your interconnectedness with people, with the community. And I think that also pulls us into a recognition that when we're talking about abundance and scarcity, it's not just money that we're talking about. Certainly money is the easiest way to describe it.
Right.
But when we think about the space for people who need friendship and relationship and those sorts of things, that also is about theology of abundance and theology of scarcity. I know I've experienced it with like jobs, right? When you're looking for a job and it's like, there's just not enough jobs and not enough jobs for people like me. And so there's just never going to be enough. But what does it look like to trust, especially in a ministry context, I think, to trust that God is calling us to ministry and that could look like something we don't expect, but that there is always enough for everyone.
And one interesting way that I've heard this applied without using the phrasing exactly, without calling it this exactly, in a social way, is, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, Emily, but I have occasionally been at a party or a social event or something like that, before the pandemic, of course, and had a conversation with someone where they spent 5 straight minutes telling me about how no one wanted to talk to them, and you try to change the topic, and they keep going back to, but it doesn't matter because no one's going to want to talk to me. And
it's like, hello.
I'm talking to you right now. Yes, I think this is a conversation. Am I, hallucinating? I don't understand. And the thing is, they are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy because, of course, no one's going to want to talk to you because that is the most boring and irritating conversation ever. Okay, probably not ever, but pretty close. Like, it's on the list, all right? And that's a theology of scarcity. That's a scarcity mindset. That is a mindset that says that I will never have enough friends or never be enough to have friends. And if you lock yourself into that, then congratulations, that's your life. But if you allow yourself to believe that maybe there are some people who are weird in similar ways to me, or at least in compatible ways, then you can go looking for them and hope that they will be there.
Yeah, I had that when I was growing up, especially in middle school. There were 32 people in our class, and there were 22 boys and me and 8 girls. And at the time, I had no concept of gender and all of that. So I talk about it as having 9 girls, right? 9 girls is not enough.
Right.
That's like truth.
That would be
and
31
reality.
Students, but yes.
Well, we had 31 sometimes and 32 sometimes. We had 9 girls.
Some students are imaginary. That's
sometimes
fine.
32, sometimes 31. So sometimes 22 boys and sometimes 23 boys.
Okay.
But 9 is just a terrible number because everybody is supposed to be friends.
Right.
It's not quite big enough to have multiple friend groups.
Yeah. I am so grateful I went to larger schools. Like, they weren't huge, but there was a decent variety of people, and if I was endlessly sick of someone, I could avoid them for the day,
Yeah, and the school was great academically, and just not great for that. But I remember distinctly a friend, we were at a sleepover, all the girls, and a friend would go play with the popular ones, and then come back and complain to me when they didn't want to play with her or whatever. And then we'd hang out, and then she'd go back the first second she could to them, and I was like, you're complaining that they don't want to hang out with you, and then you only hang out with me when they're not available.
Yeah, that's not great.
Yeah, that's not what it means or looks like to be genuinely friends with another person. And I think that's real. I think not all the time, but a lot of times, especially in the pandemic, we've gotten so isolated that it can be easy to feel like we don't have any friends or any community. And the reality is, if we actually sat down and thought about all of the people in our lives and the people who we could reach out to, I think both we have more than we think.
Yeah.
And we don't need as many as we think we need.
Right.
I actually don't need a huge friend group.
Right. That can be exhausting.
Yeah, I'm an introvert. Like, stay back. But I do have friends, and I do have people that I can rely on and connect with. Yeah.
So I think we should talk about some things that abundance theology is not, because it gets confused with some things occasionally.
Yes. So, first off, theology of abundance is not the prosperity gospel.
Yay.
Right? Prosperity gospel is that is preached is if you have enough faith, if your faith is strong enough, if you believe in God enough, if you have the right beliefs, then God will provide. This also comes out of megachurch, evangelical, pastory millionaires.
Not that we're naming names because we don't want to get sued.
Joel Osteen. Former pastors as well.
Yeah.
Who will say, right, like the framing is...
God wants you to be rich.
God wants you to be rich. And it's a, you give and it'll come back to you tenfold, right? And the idea is you give me your money and then trust that I am telling you the truth of God and that God will provide. And what that actually does is it exploits poor people because they don't know that. They're making that up. Their plan is just to get themselves excessive wealth, not to provide abundance for the whole community. And so it's complicated and it's a like weird Ponzi scheme type of like...
Yeah. Also, it can play into things other than just straight up money, like prosperity gospel will tell you that if you're healthy, it's because you're good and God loves you. And if you're sick, that's because you've done bad things, even if you don't know it, and God hates you.
Yep.
And that right there, friends, is a theology of scarcity all over the place.
Yeah. Or you're not getting better because you're not praying hard enough.
Or you're not praying right.
Yeah. And this also connects with ableism, right? The idea that if you are chronically ill or if you are disabled, it is because of a fault in your faith. It's not because of the reality
Jesus
that...
said that's wrong. Like, literally in the Bible. Please read the Bible.
Jesus explicitly said that's not how it works. Right? People who are disabled bear the image of God in their disabled bodies.
Yes.
Same with people who are chronically ill. Yes. Bear the image of God in their chronically ill bodies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another thing that abundance theology is not is magical thinking. Which my personal favorite example for this is the guy from the movie Shakespeare in Love, who keeps saying that it's all going to be fine. I don't know. It's a mystery, is his constantly repeated line. It'll be fine. It'll work out. It always works out. It's a mystery. Like, okay, on the one hand, there's hope, and on the other hand, there's magical thinking, and this is clearly magical thinking. This guy has no plan. This guy has no actual hand in making things better or fixing things. He is just convinced that the people around him will make it happen. Now, as it happens, it turns out he's right. But that isn't something you should take as encouragement. So,
also, if you want an example of theology of abundance, my Pride project this year, which this is the first year I've ever done a Pride project. It's kind of like Lent, but not. Because there was a meme going around that was like, my well-intentioned good neighbor just asked me what I'm giving up this year for Pride. No. Right, and the person who shared it said that when they had first seen it, the person had said, men. Which is like a perfect thing for the lesbian to answer, right? Like, I'm giving up men this year. But even in my own experiences of what I usually find more meaningful is to take on something, a spiritual practice or something like that. But so this year for my Pride project, last year we did like Pride movie month with my roommates. And then in July, it was Christmas in July. But this year I was thinking about it, and the show Pose on FX, the first 2 seasons of which are also on Netflix, has been my Pride project. And the character who most embodies a theology of abundance is Blanca Evangelista. And she's one of the main characters, and she founds the House of Evangelista. But the context is the middle and height of the AIDS crisis.
Right.
And it's BIPOC queer community in New York and the ballrooms and that sort of thing. And there's a sense in the ballrooms of extravagance, but there's also this community and the way that Blanca understands what it means to be a house in the ballroom context, but also what it means to be the ballroom community is so much a theology of abundance, a theology that says there is enough and we can do this together. Yeah. And she does that in a way that challenges when people are trying to cut each other down and brings them back together to lift everybody up together, which is beautiful.
Yes.
I love Blanca.
Also, I like to think that abundance theology gives us the very best bakery name ever, which would be Abundance Bakery, which I would love to find a bakery that actually has that name one day, because I think it should have a little dancing bun as their logo.
That would be awesome. Abundance. There is in Pose, one of the houses is the House of Abundance.
Ooh, awesome.
Not in this sense of that we've been talking about, but now as we dive into the readings, our first reading is Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 through 33. The book of Lamentations recounts the Babylonian takeover of Jerusalem, including the destruction of the temple in 587 BCE. And we read that although God's judgment is true, God won't abandon God's people forever.
Fun fact, in my Hebrew Bible class in seminary, we eventually realized that Babylonian exile is basically the catch-all answer for any question about the Hebrew Scriptures that you don't know the answer to. If somebody asks you a question about the Hebrew Scriptures and you have no idea, just guess Babylonian exile, and you actually have a shot. It might be right.
That's like the children's sermon answer being God, Jesus, the Bible.
Yes, or Jesus, Holy Spirit, Grace is the version I grew up with, but yes.
I like that one better because I like the Holy Spirit. She's my favorite. And
yes.
Grace is, pretty Lutheran. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of waiting or patience. People are lamenting the destruction of the temple and the Babylonian takeover. And so they're in this space of waiting where they're saying, okay, but this is not the end. God will do a new thing. God always does a new thing in the morning, sometime to come. And I was thinking about waiting and patience and where that comes in. And that's usually the part that gets left out of most novels. Because it's not the exciting part, it's not the fun part, it's not the anything part, except for Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings strikes me as, and it's been a while since I read the books, but there's just so much of slow description. So instead of sitting in the waiting, it's that it's filled in with description.
Yes.
With the description
you
of
just
all
read
of
about
the
the forest for 20 pages.
And the forest and the fighting and all of those things. So yeah, so it's just trying to think of when there's waiting and patience, and there's not, because that's not how plots work.
I think in the Bible they fill that space up with genealogies and census reports.
That would make sense as well.
And it would explain why I've never gotten through the entire book of Numbers. I keep trying, but oh my goodness.
But there are also really great stories snuck into Numbers,
yes,
right?
Which is the irritating part, because you miss the weird stuff if you,
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. In verse 26, we read, "It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." Okay, I don't claim to be the expert on waiting quietly, but I do like to think that this verse means that one does not have to go knocking on every door in your neighborhood asking people if they found Jesus, as though he is hiding behind their living room curtain like in one of my very favorite cartoons, which you have probably seen and we will link to. While sharing the gospel is certainly part of what we are called to as Christians in our Christian lives, I have always believed that it should arise out of genuine relationship and respect, not colonialism or self-righteousness or, wanting to tick off that box on the list of things Christians are supposed to do.
Yeah. The whole concept of door knocking, in my opinion, is like some hellscape extroverts thought of to torture introverts.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Nope. Not what I... No.
I genuinely like talking to people about things that actually matter, but that is not how you get a conversation about something that matters. That is how you make, 8th graders cry. Not that I'm talking about my personal life. I was not the one to make the 8th grader cry. I was the 8th grader, let's be clear. So.
I was just thinking about when I was in Utah, the number of different people who came knocking on my door, whether it was like...
Oh my goodness.
LDS, elders, sisters, a cult, and a conservative Christian group, because I lived in the... This is where it ties in with the theology of abundance and the exploitation of poor people. I lived in the cheapest place possible in my area because of the way that churches don't usually pay their staff well enough. So, I was just like, nope. I also read verse 26 and was thinking about that, but was thinking about it in a very different context. I was thinking about it more in the introspection type of way when it's waiting quietly. And it reminded me of in Fahrenheit 451, part of what gets critiqued is that everybody has something on all the time. The TVs have become the entire walls, and they're always talking at people and making noise so that there's not the space for people to even sit and think, which is strategic, right? Because when you have the space to sit and think, then you can resist, then you can be creative, then you can remember the books that are being burned, all of that stuff.
Yes. And so some people actually like having background noise, and that's different. But being forced into it is a whole separate thing.
Yeah. Background noise is one thing, and I like that sometimes too, but I also really value the space for silence and reflection and art. That's where I do art, in those spaces. The other verse that I really was struck by was verse 30, where it says, to give one's cheek to the smiter and be filled with insults, this willingness to put yourself in the way of punishment. And that reminded me of Katniss in Catching Fire, the second Hunger Games book, when Gale is caught with a turkey and there's a whole new group of peacekeepers, aka police. You know how we feel about them. Well, you know how I feel about them for sure. And so Gale is taken to the whipping post and is being whipped, and Katniss, without hesitation, goes up and gives her cheek. Literally, she gets whipped across the cheek because she gets in the way of Gale being harmed further.
Yeah. In verses 32 and 33, we read, although God causes grief, God will have compassion according to the abundance of God's steadfast love, for God does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. So this sounds at first like it's a contradiction. I mean, how can God cause grief but also never willingly afflict anyone? That sounds kind of twisted. But if God created the universe, and grief is in the universe, then technically God caused all of the grief in the universe to happen. But that doesn't mean that God intentionally, picked this piece of grief and threw it at you personally. That's a slightly different thing. It's not the same thing as setting out to afflict or irritate or murder a specific person. And this makes me think of a line in The Chronicles of Riddick, which is a Vin Diesel movie. Riddick at one point says that he believes in God and absolutely hates God for how Riddick's life has turned out, which that's a whole long series of tragedy and pain and so forth, as you might imagine. But he's also basically assuming that God has done all that stuff intentionally at him in particular, which, as it turns out, yes, he is playing a fairly large role in the universe, but he doesn't know that to begin with, and please don't think that God is intentionally, bothering you with this because God wants you to be in pain, because chances are you are not that major of a figure in the universe, and God is certainly personally concerned with you, but God is personally concerned with everyone. And you don't assume that this thing is done just to bother you. Which reminds me of one of the funniest jokes that I tend to hear a lot during Pride Month, which is when queer people react to, their personal grocery store being out of their favorite flavor of ice cream or similar things by saying, that's homophobic.
I have said that.
It's fun.
It's fun. Yeah. But I think this also goes to what we were talking about, right, with the theology of abundance, and that when God is talking about humanity, and English is very unfortunate.
We do not have a theology of abundance about the English language. The English language is broken and sad.
Yeah. But so much of the Bible, whenever it says you, is a plural in the original language, but English doesn't differentiate between those well. And our culture is so individualistic that it just ends up being assumed you singular. But the reality is that it should be assumed you plural unless otherwise clarified. And so that's part of it, is like, God does care about you all, as humanity, as communities.
Which is part of why one of Emily's more lasting contributions to the Christian faith will be a new version, a new revised standard version of the Bible, where all of the plural yous are translated as y'all, but nothing else will change. Aside from, well, I'm sure you'll fix a couple of real, bloopers, but...
I was going to say, I would do it and call it the new revised expansive version.
Ooh!
Because I would also probably go through and expand the way pronouns are used.
Yes, and there are a few bloopers in there. But...
That's true. There are a few bloopers.
Our second reading for this episode is from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 7 through 15. Paul calls on the Corinthians to share their wealth as they have committed to doing, making sure that everyone has enough and no one has too much.
One of the themes for this passage, which will surprise no one based on our deep dive, is capitalism is evil.
Yay!
So Paul is pointing out the ways that abundance for some means lack for others. And that's what we talk about when we talk about billionaires and poverty. What a surprise! There's actually no way to be a billionaire without basically exploiting people. It's basically impossible these days. And that's the recipe. Abundance for some means lack for others is the recipe for so many different dystopias, right? The Hunger Games. The capital has abundance. The district's scarcity. An Ember in the Ashes. The marshals have abundance. The scholars have scarcity. So they're all rooted in this idea as the enforced structure for society. There's always a military presence, some sort of violent enforcement for all of this, whether it's the peacekeepers in the Hunger Games or the marshals and the masks in An Ember in the Ashes.
Yes. And if we have any billionaires listening to this episode who are hurt and afflicted by the concept that it's impossible to be a billionaire without exploiting people, I would like to offer you a personal challenge. If you give me $1 billion of your own money, then I will show you how to be a billionaire without exploiting people. Hint, it involves giving all of it away.
I am with you on that. I will also... You should just give all of us $1 billion.
I think Jeff Bezos is almost there, so, any day now.
Yeah, I mean, part of me is like, why don't we just shoot him into space? Leave him there. And then we'll just seize his billions of dollars. Trillions of dollars, almost. This is where those, occasionally in the Bible, okay, my favorite psalm is Psalm 139, right? I love it. The end of it is really problematic. But I love that part because... the other half of praying to God to do really terrible things is trusting that God knows when to respond with, no child.
No.
Not
That's
happening.
a bad idea. Please stop that. Here, have a snack and a nap, and maybe a plant to sit under, some combination of Elijah and Jonah, and calm the heck down. Yeah. In verse 7, we read, "Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you." And it's kind of weird to see Paul describing the Corinthians as basically perfect in every way here, because he had to write this second letter to the Corinthians, because the first one didn't go over so well, and he had to write the first letter because they were getting stuff wrong in the first place. Corinth is not a city of Rory Gilmore's. These are not cities filled with perfect people. That is not how this works. Also, Rory Gilmore wasn't perfect, but you have to watch until, season 6 to figure that out.
I love the Gilmore Girls.
I do too.
For their time.
I'm still kind of pissed that Dean got shafted the way he did, but moving on. But yeah, Corinth is not a city of perfect people, and I believe that if you read this verse in the larger context, you will get the feeling that Paul is trying to make a point here, and maybe phrasing things intentionally that way.
Yeah. Corinth. Complicated people. And really diverse. That's part of it, right? Is to name diversity not only of economics, but other areas of diversity as well.
The main port city of Greece. Yes, there's a lot of different kinds of people there.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them suck, and Paul has some things to say about that.
True. In verse 9 we read, "For you know the generous act of Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich." I, of course, immediately thought of The Prince and the Pauper, but the version of The Prince and the Pauper that I thought of was the Wishbone version. So I have like a wishbone dog running around as both the prince and the pauper.
Oh, goodness.
I love it. Also, if you want a Christmas rom-com version of that, the Princess Switch movies also do a great job of somewhat accidentally and then on purpose switching up who's the royalty and who is not.
Cool. In verses 10 and 11, we read, "And in this matter I am giving my advice. It is appropriate for you who began last year, not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it." Yes, sometimes you do, in fact, have to finish doing the thing. It can't just go on forever. If you don't finish doing the first thing, you will never get to give the second thing your full attention. So, Paul would like to suggest that occasionally, if you have been trying to do something, that you finish at least trying to do it, even if you don't succeed. For example, Kirk, who would eventually become Captain Kirk in Star Trek, constantly retaking the Kobayashi Maru, was not, in fact, an example of how awesome he was. It was an example of him bothering the faculty and staff at Starfleet Academy to the point where a lot of them were deeply irritated because he would not let it go.
Huh. I was still on your comment about Rory Gilmore, and so I was thinking of Kirk from the Gilmore Girls.
No, not,
and I was
not
like,
that
oh, that's a very different Kirk. But then once you got to the end of like constantly irritating, I was like, maybe it is the same Kirk. Who knows?
Now I kind of want the show where that Kirk is in Star Trek and also still has the name Kirk, except it's his first name and not his last name. And then, it could be the new episode of Lower Decks or something. Yeah, that's
I don't know what Lower Decks is. But
Lower Decks is one of the newer Star Trek shows that I have not actually started watching yet, but it is specifically about the people who aren't captains or commanders or high-ranking officers. It is about the ordinary folks in Star Trek.
Nice. That's like how I want a show. Well, I don't anymore because J.K. Rowling's a TERF, but I wanted a show of the professors at Hogwarts.
Yes.
Where like all of the stuff that's happening with the kids is still present, but the actual main stuff is about the professors.
That's what fanfiction is for.
It's true.
Yeah.
In verse 14, Paul's talking about the gift of the abundance of the Corinthians to provide for others' needs so that their abundance may be provided for the Corinthians' needs and to have this fair balance between them all. And I love, that Paul is talking about that and recognizing that there are different types of abundance and different types of needs, and so they can balance out in ways that are not just transactional monetary things. But also it reminded me of Bitter Blue, which I talked about a little bit before. But as she is trying to recalibrate Monsieur, her dad was a psychopath and super harmful. And so during his time, a certain select group of lords got really, really, really rich, and everybody else, like, education was discouraged, reading was discouraged, all of that stuff. And so she's trying to recalibrate the nation of Mancia so that everybody has a theology of abundance, right? Everybody has a theology of enough. Everybody has enough. And the gifts of those who were prevented from reading and prevented from learning, they get the education that they need, and their gifts of insight and resistance are given also as abundance for those who maybe had enough money or had enough education but didn't have resistance to her dad and his brainwashing abilities.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for today is Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. Jairus, a leader in the synagogue, seeks healing for his daughter and receives it, though the journey to healing is interrupted by a woman with a hemorrhage who seeks and receives healing as well. So one of the themes in this passage is this intersection of trauma, this intersection of need, where Jairus needs healing for his daughter, and then that gets interrupted by this woman who needs healing for her 12 years of hemorrhaging.
Yes.
And that's the space where I think it'd be really easy, and what we do in the church a lot of the times is we pit those two groups against each other, right? Yes. Frequently it's LGBTQ and Black, Indigenous people of color, and the church says, see, we can't have both. And sometimes we make mistakes and we fall into that trap, and other times we're able to say, no, actually, our liberation is bound up together. But in Winterkeep, the book that I just finished, which is why it's all over my mind. The mysteries that Bitterblue is trying to unravel about this new country of Winterkeep and what's going on, and some missing people of her staff and people that she knows. And then these other different mysteries that are happening from other characters all end up intertwining and intersecting. And actually, in solving one, they need to solve the other. And in solving the other, they solve this other. I think this happens a lot, where that's like how a good story is written, really, where there's all these things, and then slowly the dots start getting connected.
Yeah.
Instead of this is just way off in left field, this is way off in right field, and this is behind us.
Yeah, and none of them have anything to do with each other.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 25, we read, "Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. So, in the Bible, if you're ever asking yourself as you're reading along, could this possibly be a euphemism for something? Well, one, you'll be right more often than you would think. There's a lot, especially in English translations. Oh my goodness.
Especially if you read about feet.
Yes, but this is a family show, so we're not going to explain that one. And second, in addition to probably being right more often than you would think, I generally think that's not actually a bad thought to have when you're reading the Bible, because it will remind you that maybe not everything that you're reading should be taken the literal way that you first interpret it. Maybe this could actually mean something else is a good question to be asking yourself when you read the Bible. Mm-hmm. And if the euphemism thing is just the way you go about it, that's fine. But if you're asking yourself if this woman had some type of menstrual issue that is not explicitly called out or named, then the answer is probably yes. Which would mean that in addition to her physical suffering, which we can imagine, she would also have been ritually unclean for 12 years, and therefore she would have been separated from society in some very specific ways, and yet she still had the courage to go up to Jesus and touch him and then admit to it. And I love this story. I love her. She is one of my favorite people in the Bible. This may be my favorite gospel story ever.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's impressive. Yeah.
And yeah, it's in the lectionary.
Yeah, I think this one actually is the meaning that it's stated, right? Well, in English it says hemorrhaging, but the idea of bleeding for 12 years is not a euphemism. It's just a...
Well,
What do you mean when you say euphemism?
A child-appropriate phrase. When I was a little kid, the way that this was explained to me was that she was, like, literally hemorrhaging in some other part of her body, like internal bleeding.
Oh. I never got that explanation.
And, okay, that would also be bad. 12 years of that would be unfortunate and, all that. But also, 12 years of internal bleeding in biblical times, managing to survive that long would be pretty flippin' unusual. So, probably this is actually a menstrual thing, and maybe my Sunday school teachers were a little freaked out about the concept of having to explain menstruation to a 10-year-old whose parents had refused to have that conversation with her yet.
Okay.
Happily, my 6th grade health class was a little bit more explanatory, but...
Okay. My understanding of euphemism is, like, referring to sex stuff.
I mean, that is one type of euphemism, but in my experience, a euphemism can be anything from sex to referring to something that we prefer not to talk to children about, and by we, I mean, certain types of adults. And also, there are plenty of euphemisms for various swear words. So, euphemism is just a more socially polite and appropriate way of phrasing something that isn't something you talk about in public.
Yeah.
But yes, often sex.
Okay. That makes more sense. Yeah, I just always had learned this one as being connected to menstruation.
Okay.
So, maybe, who knows? Who knows what our listeners have heard this one?
Well, and also, I think the whole menstruation versus the little girl being healed thing sets up a very interesting child and adult parallel, which I don't think I've ever heard anyone explore.
Oh, we have very different experiences.
Okay.
I guess I've mostly heard it from other pastors and seminarians in seminary, but like the connection has always been pretty clear to me, I think, of the child who is probably maybe 12 years old and the woman who's bleeding for 12 years, which is why they intersect and why we can see the potential for someone to try to set them up as mutually exclusive healings.
Right. But no, Jesus can do both. Absolutely.
Which is what happens in verse 30, right? Jesus... Well, okay, not verse 30, verse 35. But first, verse 30, because this woman goes up to Jesus and touches his cloak, and then Jesus, immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Surrounded by a crowd of people. She's like, who touched my clothes? Sometimes I read it differently, but this time when I read it, I definitely heard this all happen through Iron Man, right? Through Tony, where he's, especially at the very beginning, when he's still super full of himself, super egotistical, and he's surrounded by a crowd, and then is like, wait, who deigned to touch me? Like,
And now I have a mental image of Jesus with Tony Stark's facial hair. Okay.
You're welcome. In verse 35, though, is where that space opens up of two seemingly conflicting realities of the woman who's just been healed of hemorrhages and the child who now is said to have died. Some people from the leader's house come to Jesus and say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? And that dynamic reminded me of what happens with Coco, where Miguel, the main character in the movie Coco, is supposed to choose between music and family. That's the whole dichotomy that's set up. But he only has until sunrise to figure it out. Otherwise, he's going to be stuck in the land of the dead forever. And it gets to the point where finally they figure out all of the things that's happening and who his real grandfather is and all of that stuff. And then it's too late for him. He thinks it's too late for him for his great-grandfather to be remembered because they lost the picture and it's this sadness and all of this stuff. And then in that moment, his family is like, no, you know what? More important than losing the music is you being able to go back. And he goes back and it's not actually too late because his grandmother still has the picture hidden of her father, his great-grandfather. And so they get to put it up on the altar for Dia de Muertos. And he gets to be remembered. And it's this beautiful thing that I love of, like, he thinks it's too late, and then there's a new way that is found. And it's not.
And then in verses 39 and 40, we read Jesus say, why do you all weep? The child is not dead but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Okay, so I don't know about you, but the first time I read this, that read kind of weird to me. I was not expecting them to laugh at him.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that grief does weird things to people. Like, okay, maybe you would at first expect them to get angry at Jesus for saying that she's not dead, or maybe you would expect them to get even more sad because here's this clueless person wandering in and interrupting their grief. Or this
person who's mocking their grief, like,
right.
Psh.
But this might also just be like slightly hysterical grief laughter that does happen sometimes, which reminds me of the movie Ever After. When Henry finally proposes to Danielle, and she is just so overwrought, she has been through so much, especially in the last several days, that she starts laughing and then she starts to cry. Sometimes your emotions are just broken, and that leads to unexpected laughter. That may be what was going on there.
Yeah, I don't think I've actually seen Ever After.
It's very sweet.
I'll take your word for it.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 6th Sunday after Pentecost with our special guest, Reverend Alejandra Alfaro Santis. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.